Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Nikki Newman, who stands rigid beside her counsel, pearls clenched between trembling fingers, her composure held together by willpower alone, while Victor Newman sits just behind her with his jaw locked, eyes blazing with the kind of fury that has toppled empires, the kind that warns of storms to come, because the judge's next words do not merely announce a verdict, they detonate a lifetime of carefully curated truths, beginning with the revelation of evidence long buried and painstakingly assembled. Financial ledgers tied to shell companies Nikki once claimed ignorance of, forensic handwriting analysis matching her hand to offshore authorization forms, timestamps that contradict sworn testimony, and most damning of all, a recovered audio file authenticated by independent experts in which Nikki's voice, unmistakable and raw, discusses the strategic concealment of assets during a period when Victor was under federal scrutiny, evidence that leaves the courtroom gasping as if the walls themselves have inhaled sharply. Nikki's face draining of color as she stares straight ahead, eyes glassy, lips parted but unable to form words, while Victor surges to his feet, his attorney grasping his sleeve in vain, because Victor knows betrayal when he hears it, and this is not merely legal peril, it is personal annihilation, the kind that strikes at the heart of loyalty, and the judge, unmoved by the drama, continues with relentless precision, laying out a timeline that paints Nikki not as a confused spouse swept up in Victor's ruthless machinations, but as an active, calculating participant who made independent decisions to obstruct justice, a finding supported by encrypted emails retrieved from a long-dormant server once believed destroyed, emails that reveal Nikki coordinating with a third-party fixer, now deceased, conveniently until his digital footprint rose from the grave, to move funds, alter records, and pressure witnesses, the judge's voice echoing as he notes that this evidence was corroborated by testimony from a surprise witness whose identity had been sealed until this very moment, prompting the bailiff to escort forward a figure that sends a shockwave through the gallery as Ashley Abbott steps into view, composed yet visibly burdened, her presence alone rewriting assumptions as she testifies that Nikki confided in her during a night of despair years ago, confessing fears not of Victor's retaliation but of being exposed for actions she initiated. Words that Ashley had long tried to forget but could no longer ignore when subpoenaed, and as Ashley speaks, Nikki's breath catches, memories crashing in, while Victor's fury sharpens into something colder, more dangerous, because Ashley's testimony confirms what Victor had never allowed himself to consider, that Nikki had moved not as his shield but as her own architect, and the judge, sensing the weight of the moment, pauses only to emphasize the legal consequence, stating that the court finds Nikki Newman guilty on counts of obstruction and conspiracy, a verdict that lands like a hammer blow, freezing Nikki in disbelief as murmurs explode into chaos, her attorney urgently whispering about appeals while Nikki's gaze drifts to Victor, searching for rescue, for understanding, for the familiar ironclad defense he has always provided, but Victor does not meet her eyes, his face a mask carved from granite, because the anger surging through him is not the explosive rage he unleashes on enemies but a deeper, more devastating realization that the woman he loved made choices that endangered the Newman legacy without his command, without his consent, and that loss of control cuts him more deeply than any legal defeat. The judge continuing with sentencing parameters and remanding decisions that promise further hearings, but the damage is already done. The public narrative rewritten in real time as reporters furiously type, as Jack Abbott watches from the back with an expression that mixes grim satisfaction and sorrow, because victory tastes bitter when it confirms the worst suspicions, and as the gavel finally falls, Nikki sways, nearly collapsing, steadied only by her attorney, her disbelief giving way to a hollow numbness as she is escorted past flashing cameras, each step echoing with the shattering of an identity she built on resilience and redemption, while Victor remains behind for a heartbeat too long, staring at the bench as if daring the law itself to challenge him, then turning sharply, fury radiating as he storms out, already plotting, because Victor Newman does not accept endings, he transforms them into wars, and yet Even as he vows retaliation against those he believes orchestrated this exposure, a fissure opens within him, a crack formed by the knowledge that this time the enemy was not an abbot, not a rival CEO, not a corrupt official, but Nikki herself. And that realization reverberates across Genoa City, altering alliances, igniting vendettas, and setting the stage for consequences that will ripple through every corner of the young and the restless. Because in this courtroom, truth did not merely surface, it obliterated, leaving behind stunned silence, blazing anger, and a future no one can predict. The aftermath does not arrive gently. It surges like a second tidal wave crashing over the already wrecked shore of the verdict, and the courthouse corridors become narrow tunnels of sound and fury as Nikki is guided forward. The click of her heels a metronome counting down the collapse of certainty, her mind replaying the judge's words in a relentless loop while flashes pop and shouted questions ricochet off marble walls, each one an accusation sharpened by spectacle, and somewhere behind her, Victor's footsteps thunder with purpose, his anger now a living thing that seems to bend the air, because even as he burns with betrayal he recognizes the chessboard has expanded, that the evidence revealed today did not materialize by accident, but was curated, timed, and weaponized, and this awareness steadies him, hardens him, transforming raw fury into a strategic blaze as he scans faces, lawyers whispering, rivals smirking, former allies avoiding eye contact, and catalogs every slight, every tremor of fear, every flicker of opportunism that will soon be repaid in kind, while Nikki, seated at last in a private room meant to shield her from the storm, stares at her reflection in a darkened window and sees not the woman she believed herself to be, but a stranger defined by public disgrace. Her disbelief slowly melting into a crushing grief that presses on her chest as memories of choices made in panic and pride resurface with merciless clarity. The night, she convinced herself that protecting the family justified crossing lines, the moment she believed she could outmaneuver the truth, and now the truth has outmaneuvered her, leaving her grasping for Victor's forgiveness even as she fears it may be the one thing beyond her reach. Because Victor's love has always been forged in loyalty and control, and today both were severed. Yet even in this private reckoning Nikki is not afforded peace. For the legal machinery grinds on outside, prosecutors celebrating a landmark win, defense attorneys drafting appeals, analysts dissecting implications for Newman Enterprises stock, and Genoa City itself buzzing with the electric thrill of scandal, as if the town feeds on the collapse of its titans. And amid this frenzy, old wounds reopen as Jack Abbott steps into the hallway light, fielding questions with a measured restraint that fools no one, because his eyes betray a storm of conflicting emotions. Vindication for years of suspicion, regret for the pain inflicted, and the uneasy knowledge that today's victory may provoke tomorrow's retaliation, a knowledge shared by Ashley, who retreats from the cameras with shoulders squared but heart heavy, knowing her testimony, truthful though it was, has forever altered her relationship with Nikki and may have drawn a target on her back, for Victor Newman does not forget, and while he may not yet act, he always remembers, storing grievances like ammunition. And as Victor finally enters Nikki's room, the silence between them is deafening, charged with everything unsaid, everything irreparably changed, his eyes searching hers not for excuses but for answers, and Nikki tries to speak, to explain the fear and desperation that drove her, but words falter under the weight of his stare, because Victor does not need explanations, he needs certainty, and certainty has been shattered, his voice low and controlled as he asks the question that cuts deepest. Not why she did it, but why she did it without him, and Nikki's tears spill as she realizes the magnitude of that truth, that in trying to protect what they built she acted alone, and in doing so undermined the very foundation of their partnership, and Victor turns away, not in rejection but in restraint, because if he speaks further his anger might scorch everything beyond repair, and this moment of restraint becomes its own kind of punishment, leaving Nikki suspended in agony, uncertain whether the silence signals the end or merely a pause before something far worse. And outside, the legal reverberations widen as the judge's detailed findings circulate, analysts noting the precision with which the evidence dismantled Nikki's defense, The way the recovered audio clip humanized intent, the email's established pattern, and Ashley's testimony supplied motive, a trifecta that leaves little room for doubt, prompting speculation about additional indictments, about who else might be implicated by the digital trail now exposed. And Victor reads these reports with a predator's focus, recognizing vulnerabilities and opportunities in equal measure, because if Nikki's fall weakens the Newman brand, then Victor will rebuild it by any means necessary, even if that means sacrificing relationships once deemed untouchable. And as evening descends on Genoa City, the courthouse empties, but the shock does not dissipate, instead seeping into living rooms and boardrooms, into whispered conversations at Crimson Lights, and tense meetings at Jabot, where executives weigh whether to capitalize on Newman turmoil or brace for retaliation. And in this charged atmosphere, alliances shift subtly as people choose sides not with declarations but with glances and silences, knowing that Victor's response will define the next chapter, and that chapter begins quietly, almost deceptively so, as Victor summons his inner circle and issues crisp directives that ripple outward: secure communications, audit internal systems, identify leaks, apply pressure where pressure can be applied, his anger now fully transmuted into action, while Nikki, alone at home later that night, surrounded by luxury that suddenly feels like a cage, confronts the reality of potential sentencing, of public penance, of the possibility that Victor's protection may no longer be absolute, and she clings to the fragile hope that time and truth might yet salvage something from the wreckage, even as she fears that the verdict has not only judged her actions but redefined her identity. And as dawn approaches, the town holds its breath, because everyone senses that today was not an ending but an ignition, the spark that will set off a chain of events fueled by pride, love, vengeance, and regret. And in the young and the restless, such forces never burn out quietly. They roar, consuming everything in their path until only the strongest, or the most ruthless, remains standing. As the next days unfurl like a slow, merciless reckoning, the shock of the verdict deepens rather than fades, settling into Genoa City with the weight of inevitability, because scandals of this magnitude do not simply pass through, they embed themselves into the marrow of everyone involved, reshaping futures in ways both subtle and catastrophic. And Nikki feels this truth with every breath as she wakes each morning to a world that suddenly feels hostile and exposed, the once comforting walls of the Newman Ranch now echoing with silence and judgment, every portrait and polished surface a reminder of the legacy she helped build and may now help dismantle, while Victor moves through the same spaces like a storm contained within flesh, his anger no longer explosive but deliberate, simmering beneath a veneer of control that unnerves everyone around him, because this is the Victor Newman who calculates, who waits, who strikes when the damage will be maximal and irreversible. And as legal analysts dissect the verdict on television and social media ignites with fevered speculation, Victor's mind is already several moves ahead, considering not only Nikki's appeal but the broader implications for Newman Enterprises, for the trust of shareholders, for the perception of invincibility that has always been his greatest weapon. And it is this perception that he resolves to restore at any cost, even as the cost threatens to include Nikki herself, a realization that terrifies her when she finally understands it, because Victor's love has always been intertwined with power, and when power is threatened, sentiment becomes negotiable, and yet Nikki refuses to collapse entirely into despair, drawing instead on the resilience that carried her through addiction, betrayal, and loss in years past, telling herself that this, too, can be survived if she faces it head-on. But survival demands allies, and allies are suddenly scarce, as old friends distance themselves and former confidants hesitate to answer calls, fearing guilt by association, leaving Nikki to confront the bitter irony that in protecting the family she now stands isolated from it, while Victor's children react in ways that fracture the household further. Nick, torn between anger at his mother's actions and fear for her future, Sharon urging compassion even as she recognizes the gravity of the situation. Victoria struggling with a more complex fury rooted in betrayal not just of law but of strategy, because she understands better than anyone the cost of miscalculation, and Adam, watching from the periphery, his expression unreadable, senses opportunity as much as tragedy, because upheaval has always been the soil in which he thrives, and this awareness does not escape Victor, who studies Adam closely, measuring loyalty against ambition, knowing that in times like these blood ties can be either anchors or weapons. And as days turn into weeks, the legal process tightens its grip on Nikki's life. Hearings scheduled, motions filed, every step scrutinized by a public hungry for spectacle, and in the midst of this, a new revelation surfaces. Not another piece of evidence against Nikki, but a hint that the investigation's reach may extend further than anyone anticipated. Whispers of additional financial anomalies linked to a rival corporation, whispers Victor seizes upon with ferocity. Because if Nikki is to fall, he will ensure she does not fall alone, launching a counteroffensive through private investigators and legal maneuvering that blurs the line between defense and revenge. And Genoa City feels the tension spike as rumors spread of subpoenas expanding, of deals being offered behind closed doors, of secrets long thought buried clawing their way to the surface, and Nikki watches this unfold with a mix of horror and grim fascination, realizing that her actions have become the catalyst for a reckoning that could consume far more than her own reputation, and this knowledge weighs heavily on her conscience, pushing her toward a decision she has long avoided, to take full responsibility publicly, to own her mistakes without deflection, even if doing so costs her Victor's support. And when she finally voices this intent, the confrontation that follows is volcanic, Victor's restraint finally cracking as he accuses her of undermining his efforts, of surrendering leverage, of confusing guilt with strategy, while Nikki counters with a raw honesty that strips away pretense, telling him that power without integrity has hollowed them both out, that she can no longer live behind calculated denials. And for a moment, just a moment, Victor looks stunned, confronted with a truth he has spent a lifetime outrunning, and though he does not concede, the exchange leaves a mark, a fissure that neither anger nor control can fully seal. And outside the ranch, Genoa City responds to Nikki's eventual public statement with polarized fervor, some condemning her as emblematic of elite hypocrisy, others praising her accountability, and this division mirrors the fractures spreading through the town's power structures. As corporations reassess partnerships, charities distance themselves, and political figures quietly recalibrate alliances, because the Newman name, once synonymous with dominance, now carries a stain that cannot be ignored. And Jack Abbott, observing these shifts, finds himself grappling with an unexpected unease, because while part of him recognizes the strategic advantage, another part mourns the erosion of a balance that has defined Genoa City for decades. And Ashley, too, feels the weight of unintended consequences, haunted by the knowledge that truth, once unleashed, does not discriminate in what it destroys. And as tensions escalate, an emergency hearing looms, one that could determine whether Nikki faces incarceration or a negotiated settlement. And the night before, she sits alone, writing letters she may never send, to her children, to Victor, to herself, articulating regrets and hopes with a clarity born of desperation. And when Victor finds her at dawn, the air between them softened by exhaustion, their exchange is quieter, stripped of accusation, acknowledging love without guarantees, loyalty without illusions, because both understand that whatever the outcome, they've crossed a threshold from which there is no return. And in the courtroom once more, as the judge reviews arguments and considers precedent, the entire town seems to lean forward, aware that this decision will not only shape Nikki's fate, but signal whether the era of unchecked power is truly waning. And as the ruling is delivered, measured, conditional, severe yet tempered, the reaction ripples outward, relief mingling with disappointment, outrage colliding with acceptance, and Nikki feels something close to peace for the first time since the verdict. Not because the outcome is kind, but because it is final enough to grasp, while Victor absorbs it with a strategist's calm, already planning the long game, because he knows redemption, like revenge, is a process, not a moment. And as Genoa City exhales, adjusting to a new equilibrium forged by scandal and survival, one truth becomes undeniable. The verdict did more than judge Nikki Newman. It exposed the fragile architecture of power, love, and loyalty that underpins every rivalry and romance in the young and the restless, ensuring that nothing and no one will ever be
quite the same again.